Now we will devote ourselves to the strange prophetic figure who wasn't really discovered by the world at large as the real prophet that he was till very late in his life, but who I consider that particularly within the context of the Gnosis and of the esoteric tradition, he's definitely one of the most exciting authorities, and so much of his literature is still around, so that we certainly had to include him in our present series. Now let me see. The year 1875 heralded the last quarter of the 19th century, obviously, and in it a number of interesting events occurred which are not generally known, or if they are known, their significance is not reckoned very highly by most people. And one might as well start the one that pertains to our work here and to this building within which we hold our meetings, namely, in November of that year was the founding of the Theosophical Society in New York City by H.P. Blavatsky and H.S. Olcott, and a number of their associates, who I think, from what I read about them, would have been very enjoyable people to meet. A real combination of scholarship and bohemianism, of intellectual progress and of all kinds of interest. So, really interesting people. We wonder where are they now? How come they're not here? But anyway, they were very interesting people. Excuse me? Oh, you're one of them. Well, okay, yeah. I can kind of see. Probably one of those that caused occasional rumpus or something like that, which is very important. In any event, so that was, that turned out to be, in a historical perspective, really a very important date. It was an event. It was an event that pulled together a lot of the strings that have been woven by the esoteric tradition in earlier times, and brought about a real new era of interest in this strange field. So it is useful to remember, for instance, also that while there were a number of associations, lodges, temples, whatever you wish to call them the world over, devoted to very much the same ideas that the Theosophical Society came to pursue, this was the only organization which admitted interested people freely. It wasn't a matter of initiation. It wasn't a matter of paying big sums of money. It wasn't a matter of sacrificing your pet cat. I'm sure there were some organizations, especially in Egypt or with the Egyptian mythos, who did that. But it was open to all. Now, that doesn't mean that all of them stayed. It doesn't mean that there were many developments and many branchlets that came forth from other branches that grew on that particular tree. But it was a great opening into a thought world that previously was certainly not widely available, and which now really began to proliferate in all kinds of ways, and for which reason at least some of us still feel that we owe that tradition something, and we are in the Theosophical Society, and I have been a member now, let me see, close to 70 years. How do you like that? Unbroken membership, which doesn't mean that I didn't argue and fight with a lot of the members. Years ago, that was really a lot of fun here, because we had old-time members who belonged to the Cortona colony, which existed here at a somewhat earlier occasion. I only came here in the early 50s, and so really learned and interesting people. Also real good people to argue with, because they argued back, you know, and it was really a lot of fun, I must admit. In any event, so that was the one big thing that happened in 1875. And there were, of course, others. It was also the day of the death of one of the people without whose presence earlier in the world probably the whole flowering of esotericism in the 19th and 20th century would not have come about, namely the gentleman in Paris who called himself by the Hebrew name Eliphas Levi, whose secular name was Alphonse Louis Constant, and being somewhat of a trickster, he changed Alphonse Louis to Eliphas Levi. He was the reviver of Kabbalism and the first one to call attention to the mystery of the tarot cards, and apparently a very interesting gentleman. Once I managed to organize my very topsy-turvy, although very large library. I have somewhere a biography of Eliphas Levi that I have recommended years ago, but of course all I know is who the book is about. I don't know who wrote it, and I don't know anything else more at this point about it. But it was a very fine book, and I did many lectures out of it and used quotations from it. And it was written by a university professor, I think, in the University of Georgia in the south. Very, very fine book. So if I find it, then I can tell you what it is. Then if there is still one around, then you can get your own. Or else, I don't know, maybe we'll just do our own pirated reprint or so. It was very, very good. Anyway, Eliphas Levi died in 1875 also. And let's see, who else? Oh, well. Don't think less of me if we have mentioned this, because while the person is a controversial person within the tradition, but still I consider him a very learned man who has made significant contributions, namely Edward Alistair Crowley. He was also born in 1875, and for which reason, with his immense self-effacing tendencies, he immediately discovered that since Eliphas Levi died in 1875 and he was born in 1875, he was therefore a reincarnation of Eliphas Levi. Well, maybe he knows those things, but whatever the case may be, it's sort of amusing, and certainly a man who made an important contribution to all of these matters. And now, last not least, although others could be mentioned, in the Alps of Switzerland, in a little community, in the house of the local Zwingli Zwingli-eyed Calvinist minister, preacher. There was born a little Swiss boy by the name of Carl Gustav Jung. And I would say that maybe that finished off the last quarter of the 19th century in a manner, because even though very few people knew or know many details, I've only written 3 books about him, so maybe maybe I managed to spread the news a little bit. But let's say there is absolutely no doubt that he sounded sort of the last word on the tradition, and the approach to the esoteric tradition which he represented, I think, while it is not the only one, it is a very, very valuable one. No, so that's a good beginning. Now then, let's say 70, that was the beginning of the last quarter of the century. By that time already, there was someone who came to be connected with some of this matrix pretty soon, not very far from the mountains of Switzerland, just across the Alps into Austria. In the city of Vienna, there was a young medical doctor, very elegant and how should I put it, very conscious of his status all his life, whether other people were or not, and that was Dr. Sigmund Freud, who then became involved in the whole thing. Now, I know that it was many, many years ago, but back in the late 1950s and through the 1960s, I had the privilege of working as a literary assistant to the great American historical novelist Irving Stone, who at that time was writing a book, a historical novel, which was his métier, about Sigmund Freud, that was entitled, and I'm sure is still entitled, Passions of the Mind. So in order to do my job, which lasted about 2 years, and I was really working for Doubleday Publishers, but I was assigned to Mr. Stone. So let's say that project made me read, believe it or not, everything that was published that Sigmund Freud ever wrote. How I managed is hard to tell. And with that, I was already a closet Jungian. But I must say that I always, from reading so much about him, about his life, reading his writings, that I had developed a considerable respect for Sigmund Freud as well. Now, Freud started something which in modified forms is still with us, and this was an entirely new approach to and an entirely new way of dealing with the discipline of psychology. Until Sigmund Freud, psychology in the universities and similar institutions was considered a branch of philosophy. That's it. It was completely divorced from the medical field, but Freud happened to have been a medical doctor. And so his approach to that discipline came from a somewhat different perspective. Also, it needs to be he was, of course, of Austrian Jewish family who originally came to Austria from Poland. I don't want to be too terribly detailed about everybody, but let us say that is somewhat important, first of all, because there was a very large Jewish population in Poland. And Jewish families moved into Austria from there quite frequently because a large portion of Poland was annexed to Austria, so there was no borders. They could come from Vienna to Krakow. No, Krakow was under the Russians. And the Russians were always around in some fashion. Always annoying people. But maybe that keeps people on their toes. Certainly did at that time. Anyway, the Freud family moved to Austria. His wife's family was also from a very prominent Jewish rabbinical family, because his wife's father, I believe, was the chief rabbi of the city of Hamburg for many years. That was a very big position. In any event, he became a medical doctor at the University of Vienna, which was one of the most highly regarded medical schools, not only in Europe but in the world. And the first thing that arrested his attention was, some of you maybe guessed it, and if you didn't, and I tell you now, was hypnotism. Now, hypnotism, interestingly enough, also originated in Austria. It originated with an Austrian doctor from the state of Vorarlberg by the name of Franz Anton Mesmer, and was known for a long time as mesmerism. Although, of course, all kinds of disciplines developed from that particular tongue. But Dr. Freud got the idea that by shutting out temporarily by way of a hypnotic state the conscious, he didn't know it by that name yet, the conscious cerebration, as the British word has it, the cerebral activity of the human, one might gain access to certain aspects of the human activity, of what later on came to be called the human psyche, and that one could discover the origin, or even of, because that was Mesmer. Mesmer was a medical doctor too, but the French Academy rejected him when they were, and unfortunately, I don't like to see that because I love the man. Dr. Benjamin Franklin was one of the people who sat in the French Academy when they condemned Mesmer. So that was one thing on Franklin maybe was a bit wrong. And I'm sure that being such a good-natured, humorous gentleman, he probably would just light a cigar and say, well, of course, what do you think, who do you think I am, that I can't be wrong? In any event, Mesmer had the idea that by some mysterious process for which he sought all kinds of explanations, that a person could go into they didn't call it that yet, an altered state, a trance state, which had certain features in common with the dream state, and that in this altered state one could gain information about various health issues, even as Mesmer felt that the causative factors of certain illnesses could be discovered when people were in the mesmeric trance, which subsequently, by way of the work of a British doctor, came to be called hypnotism. So Dr. Freud felt that maybe there was a new field there worthy of exploring, and he did. He had a partner, I don't want to keep you or even myself here all night, but he had a partner by the name of Dr. Breuer, and they had a nice office, and a problem arose. The problem was that, as it so often happens with partnerships, whatever they are called, including marriages, the relationship of the two doctors was dissolved. And here was Sigmund Freud without Dr. Breuer. And a big problem that he didn't like to confess. He was a pretty bad hypnotist. So now what is he going to do? That was the whole thing. So he thought of this, he thought of that, and he still had a few patients. So he developed certain disciplines which had a good deal to do with the fact that he was convinced that when people were dreaming, they were in an altered state of consciousness, not terribly dissimilar to the one of the mesmeric trance. And actually, this is a good thing to remember even now. A dream is a different altered state of consciousness. It is an entry of another big chamber, bigger than a ballroom, figuratively speaking, of your mind. So Freud said, well, maybe I can talk to my patients and see if they have any dreams. And maybe I can discover the causes, because they all had various neurotic and maybe part psychotic symptoms. We can discover as to what makes them tick. And he hit, he really hit what would you call, what do you call it? This was like a $1 million drawing in Las Vegas, which they probably didn't have at that time. But he found something incredibly important, namely the psychological importance of the dream. And in fact, that was his entry into another world of the mind, which he worked with a great deal of alacrity and a great deal of knowledge and a great deal of energy. Now and then, on the basis of his treatments and attempted treatments of people's psychological or mental difficulties, he developed an entire theory about the dream and in what kind of a function the dream is to human beings, and how it reveals very important data about their interior life, about what came to be called by Freud the unconscious, das Unbewusste in German. And it's important to remember, because people mess around with that word. It's not subconscious, it's not half-conscious, it's unconscious. And that was the one that Freud worked with, and that is the official name. So anyway, he came to the conclusion, and I just mentioned it now, that in addition to their functioning mind with which they handle their affairs in the world, their people have another realm of mind. And that he called the unconscious, das Unbewusste. And that while being able to tell asking the patients to tell him about their dreams and receiving usually a considerable number of dreams from each patient, he came to certain conclusions as to where perhaps the causes of their mental, emotional difficulties lie. And he found that to be quite good and quite rewarding. And the dreams revealed to him sort of, in a sense, what made these people tick. And the reason for that he advanced, and I am not a Freudian, but I have a great deal of respect for his work and his connection with Jung. But let us say in fact, I think he used that metaphor. Freud was very good of picking sort of very simple, homely metaphors in order to explain what went on in people's heads. You know, and they said that the way it is that, let's say you have a house, and the house has a big underground chamber or basement or so, and then you all of a sudden you find out, maybe when you come home from a trip or something, you find out that a bunch of disreputable characters sort of, they weren't exactly street people in Vienna. I think that the imperial government looked out for the poor people quite well, much better than we do here now. But let us say so anyway, there's some people who go down there and hang out, so to say, and the owner, at least some, wants to find out what they are doing there and who they are. But in the daytime, when he goes around his house, they're hiding, so they don't come out. However, at night, they come out and slyly sneak up the stairway and enter the house and enjoy themselves in the man's house, who apparently wasn't home a good deal. So what is that? Those are the dreams. So let us say it's the content of his house. Some people who are hiding out in his house, but who don't function in the daylight. They don't function in the conscious mind. But when you are not there watching them, then they come up and have a royal good time. Or in Vienna, it would be an imperial good time. You know. So that is one of the early metaphors, that this kind of an activity at a mental level occurs within us, and that sort of a mental content which we are maybe not all that proud of, or maybe don't even like to acknowledge, and therefore we sort of push it out of our sight, down into the cellar. But when everything is quiet, and when the owner of the house is not watching, then the mysterious Viennese bums come out and have themselves a good time. And so he felt that originally by hypnosis, and later on really just having a nice, quiet, rational conversation with the patients, he could ask them about their dreams. And he found out that if a person really wants to, and if you consider that obviously an important thing, people have access to their dreams, although if they come up to you in the morning, as some people do to me, and they'll say, "What did you dream about?" you might not remember anything. But after you sort of open up the doors a little bit and you get one scene, you get another scene, maybe a voice, you can sort of pull, as I like to call it, you can pull the dream out of its hiding place, and then you have the dream. Now, that's all well and good, and you succeeded so far. But now there sits Dr. Freud in the chair next to your couch, and incidentally, the famous psychoanalytic couch has only one origin, one use, because that is what they used when the two doctors were hypnotizing. And hypnosis, as Dr. Beer, the British doctor who renamed it, hypnos in Greek means sleep, and so it was considered a kind of a sleep. So, all right, this is the natural sleep, the sleep with the dreams. And so then, when they were in an altered state, whether it was the altered state of the dream or the altered state on the hypnosis, Freud managed to disentangle. In fact, one of these analysts used that term, to untie the knots of the mind. You know, here's the big knot, and you kind of pull at it until it unties. To untie the knots of the mind and to find out what they are. Because the theory of Freud was, and it's a good theory, that there are just so many things in life that we experience and that we think about and that we desire, and maybe the opposite of desire, that we loathe, and these things are dropped into unconsciousness. They dropped out of memory, and if they can be brought back to memory, then those memories may be pertinent to the issue at hand, which in this case are the psychological difficulties, not called that yet, of the various patients. Now, Freud felt, and I think rightly so, that the majority of his sessions with his patients about the dreams were quite successful. Of course, he was the interpreter of dreams. He was the dream master. And no doubt some of his dream mastery can be disputed if one wishes. But the fact of the matter is that somehow his interpretation of the dreams and the difficulties that the patients were encountering had a relationship. He could discover that something was bothering this patient, and that bothersome thing would come out in the dreams, usually in a disguise. So you have to interpret the disguise. But after devoting himself to this for a considerable time, he felt that he sort of had the main key to the disguise. And that certain, obviously, the patient has engaged in, how could one call it, has engaged in a forgetting on purpose. And what he forgot on purpose went down into some secret subterranean chamber of the mind and sat there until the dialogue with Freud would bring it forth, and then, owing to various symbolisms in the dream that was very early recognized by him, he was a good interpreter of symbols, then it often could be found out as to what has happened to the individual. That there were some events in people's lives, also some thoughts and desires and fantasies which did not remain in the conscious focus, but which went underground into what he called the unconscious. and by gaining knowledge of them, you could often form conclusions as to how this, the name that he coined was repression, pressing on something, that these repressed mentations, how these repressions or these repressed mentations, even though they were not available to the man's waking consciousness, but they were there, and they would come forth in a dream. And earlier on, when Dr. Breuer was still there, they would come out under hypnosis. And when one discovered some of these, you found that many of them were trigger mechanisms for the neurotic and related symbols that the patients were experiencing. Or anything from sleeplessness to strange visions to strange likes and dislikes, fears, anxieties. In fact, it was Freud who coined the two words for psychological practice: fear and anxiety. Fear is the German word Furcht. I'm scared of something. I have a feeling that if I should start walking, which I don't do with great deal of skill at my age, but if I start going toward my residence down the ways a few blocks, well, maybe a band of coyotes is going to come and attack me. It has happened. It usually happens to children and pets, and I don't quite qualify for either of those, but it can happen, and various other things. So that becomes now a fixation. Later on, they came to call them complexes. Complex is just various psychological material that in the mind is somehow thrown together, and there it is. Then Jung became very important in the complex psychology. But in any event, there were a lot of people in Vienna who had various internal disturbances. I always said it was a very peaceful period. There hadn't been any war since 1814, and this was the year 1900 when the book came out. So people didn't have much to do but to come up with weird memories and weird ideas. There are other statements made about the mental life of Vienna at that time, but they are a little bit too complex, and the complex is another word for risque. So Vienna was a heck of an exciting place in those days. There was no rock music, but there was Johann Strauss and the waltzes, and everybody loved it. Everybody came to Vienna. All of my ancestors and my mother's ancestors, the Hungarian nobility, all had their particular buildings in Vienna, and they came there for the big events, both political and private. So it was a heck of a nice place, and it was the capital of a huge empire, the Holy Roman Empire, for several hundred years. Only one of the Holy Roman emperors, they were not all holy in their personal conduct, but still this was, and to address them, their mode of address in Latin was Sacra Majestas, Sacred Majesty. And so, in any event, these years, these centuries in Vienna really created a city of marvelous architecture, of a great joie de vivre, and a great openness generally to other people who came there. because the emperor's seat was sort of, well, it was the center of most of Europe, with the exception of the two holdouts. You know, a holdout and a game. The two holdouts were Britain, that always wanted to run its own show without reference to anyone else, and the French. And of course, they in turn had a lot of troubles with each other. The 100 Years' War, this kind of the Duke of Marlborough with his troops coming over from England and beating the heck out of the Frenchies, and you know, various things like that. So you know, there were some that were aside from this cultural matrix, but Vienna was a fabulous place. Now, that means that owing to the great University of Vienna and various other situations there, and consequently a great deal of medical interest in medical hospitals and so forth, there were a lot of doctors around Vienna. And the fame of Dr. Freud, even though his colleagues often very greatly disapproved of him, and in fact the disapproval mounted when he discovered, and I do, after reading so much of his material for so many years, I am convinced that he was an absolutely honest man. That man was no prevaricator, but he also felt that if he discovered something, that it should be communicated. And so he was holding lectures as a docent, which is an unpaid professor in the German universities, as a docent at Vienna University about his new theory of the mind. And a lot of the medical profession were very put out with him. He comes up with these new things, and especially when it came out after a while that in spite of his elegant and discreet way of conversing and so forth, there was one element in his lectures wherein he was reporting about his treatment of the patients, and that was the big devil sex. Namely, even though Vienna was a very, well, I don't know how should I put anywhere, a very fun city, okay? It really was. Nevertheless, people, owing to their religious background, owing to the social customs and so forth, the people had a tendency of feeling guilty about their sexuality, especially if that sexuality was not strictly regulated by the state and by the church and heaven knows who else. So people were walking around having a lot of fun, but also being quite guilty. And that all came up, a good deal of it came up in these sessions with Freud. And then also now he being a courageous man, he put it right into his big book, which came out in the year 1900, the Traumlehre, the teaching about dreams, that this was one of the most frequent difficulties that people experienced, that they had repressed sexual feelings, sexual things, and then these were working difficulties with their lives, making them fearful, making them anxious, making them feel guilty, all these things that we know well. And sort of, there was a sort of a Victorian atmosphere, and Victoria was on the throne at the time too. So that, of course, that was difficult. The society didn't want to accept that. What do you mean? What do you mean that even though we don't talk about it, that we feel guilty about sex? He said, well, I know about it because I found it in my investigations with these people. So Freud was not popular with some medical and other scientific establishments. I think one of the famous little events that occurred, he was at the university lecturing, and let's see, which one was that? Oh yeah, and he had developed, I don't think it was entirely unknown, but he had developed a diagnosis that was called hysteria. We know now what a hysterical person is. It's very opposite of a phlegmatic personality. To be around hysterical people, I think you would agree, is not the greatest joy. So he used that term that people would develop a hysteria as the result of all this material in their unconscious. And so he was lecturing there with this big room all full of doctors. So one of the doctors gets up and says, Dr. Freud, you know Greek? He says, yes, I went to the same schools as you. He says, you know that hysteron in Greek means the womb. And I understand that only women have wombs. Of course, now you get all kinds of things as to who has what, shall we say. But at that time, so how could a man be hysterical? He says, look, certain symptoms characterize a particular illness. You know that. So anyway, these were the sort of things that were thrown at him, trying to indicate that he was a charlatan, which he was not. In any event, his fame with all of this spread. And one of the places where it spread was across the Alps over to Switzerland. In Switzerland, there was a doctor a couple of decades younger than Freud, who was a grandson of one of the most famous ministers of Switzerland, the Dr. Freud of Bern, who was a very important church officer there, and whose father was also a minister. And some of the biographers once wrote that there were no less than 10 people, 10 men, obviously at that time, in his family, who were all ministers of the gospel. Now, how that poor boy grew up with that many preachers around, I don't know, but I can see that it must have been a difficult task. So, however, he was an ambitious young man, and a man who was interested in many, many things, and who came to the conclusion that he wanted to become a medical doctor, but a doctor of the mind, because the psychiatric profession existed already. And so he was, and around the time when he was sort of a young intern at Burghölzli Mental Hospital, one of these big, awesome mental hospitals in the world, in Switzerland. While he was there, he obviously learned of Dr. Freud, and he said, well, things that man says are interesting and important, and he felt that he could justify some of Freud's insights, but that he also, in his own practice, he also felt that there was something missing. That recognition is very important. But after a while, he said, well, I better go to Vienna and visit this Austrian fellow. And so he got on the train, and he went to Vienna, and he went to visit Freud and introduced himself as a colleague and so forth, and was quite favorably impressed. But then, while they were conversing obviously about their psychiatric. It wasn't called psychiatry yet. It was these people were called alienists. Now, if you say alienist, it'll be one of the people who is concerned with the flying saucers. That was not the case. So, but they also had another interest, two doctors, which has a great deal to do with the human mind, with the human psyche, but which, let's see, of different nature, and that was the occult. Not as not at a philosophical level like the Theosophical Society, but that there are hidden faculties, hidden factors in the human mind that are able to produce strange phenomena. They cause raps on the wall. They have mediums who were, and some of the mediums of that time did some pretty weird things. There was an Italian medium, one of the most famous, Eusebia Palladino. Well, with a name like that, you have to be really a big medium, and perhaps a happy medium. Anyhow, Eusebia Palladino, and there were reputable witnesses to it. Several times when in a spiritualist trance, she was lying down flat on a couch or a table or something, she would rise, she would levitate in the room, levitate out the window, and then levitate beside the building and come back to the building and through another window. She did that a number of times, very, very famous. In fact, the academician who had investigated her lived here in Los Angeles, British doctor, very, very nice man. Hereward Carrington was the doctor's name, and he comes in, anyway. He also was a medical doctor, but his chosen interest was occult phenomena. So in any way, those things were around, and they were of interest, and people were excited by them, and they tried to figure out this and that. Went to the spiritual mediums, especially, I shouldn't say that, especially if they could find a happy medium. I don't know why. This must be the Hungarian unconscious, that brings me these things. But in any event, very prominent people in America, for instance, William James, it's the greatest American psychologist and philosopher. He was very interested in occult phenomena, so were many others. So Jung said, well, all right, Dr. Something to the effect, obviously speaking in German. He said, well, Dr. Freud, because Freud was it started with Freud being put off and a little bit disturbed. He said, all of this dark flood tide of occultism, even though he was very interested in, this is going to be a difficulty for us who are reputable physicians, and so forth. So Jung, the young Jung at the time, so Jung says, but Dr. Freud, there are some of these things are actually happening. We can't really deny them. Well, I said, Freud said, yeah, I have investigated some. I am still not completely convinced. And then Jung said, but doctor, they do happen, and moreover, I'd like to tell you that there is going to be something happening here right now. And so as he said that, boom, 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 there were raps and noises from all the cabinets, and Freud's big, heavy desk was shaking like anything, and Freud was genuinely alarmed. He just said, Dr. Jung, I don't know how you do these things, but please stop it. So that was kind of their first not entirely friendly encounter, but they became quite friendly, and for a number of years there was, let's say, Freud's psychoanalytic school in Vienna, and there was Jung's school in Zurich, and this went on. But now something else happened. And this is of very great importance for our purposes, and I have to be careful also. So let us say what that was, that Freud was doing his thing in his accustomed fashion and having quite good results, and also gathering disciples, for whom, incidentally, at least the disciples in Vienna, he had very little respect. And he would say bad things about them, how stupid they were, how they wouldn't understand what he was trying to tell them, and even worse things. I don't know why, but I guess that made him feel important, because really with the overwhelming majority, while they were, sort of a little bit troublesome, talkative Viennese bunch, you can't shut up those people. You got to feed them a good Wiener Schnitzel, So in any event, those were the people around Freud, but others were coming from different countries. In fact, there was an ultimately very famous Hungarian psychiatrist. I'm sure when I'm mentioning him, then I don't get his name, but it will come to me, who was very devoted to him and others, and of course others who were coming in to visit. Now, meanwhile, of course, Jung, first in an institutional setting, and then he set up his own doctor's office in Zurich, in a very good place, which is still the Jung house, which you can visit if you, with the Swiss, there's always money. That's just a national character. It's as important as cheese. And maybe more so. But in any event, so the Jung house is the same one that he occupied for years and years and years after he was not working for the hospital anymore. In any event, Jung had quite a few patients. He did not use hypnosis, but he used pretty much the same conversational techniques that Freud used to bring things out of people. And he also worked with dreams and so forth. And he came, so he felt, to discover that these people came up with imagery. His patients, many of his patients, came up with imagery and narratives in dreams that he hadn't encountered before, and that Freud had not written about. So what is this all about? So of all, the only conclusion he could come to, that there is more to that unconscious than what Freud has so far discovered, and that he was willing and eager to devote himself to that. He wanted to find what was in the rest of the unconscious. Now, this was absolute heresy in the eyes of Sigmund Freud, because there was no there is no more unconscious than the unconscious that I have discovered, all right? Jung said, well, Dr. Freud, I'd like to agree with you, but I am finding things, so what am I to do with them? Anyway, that was the beginning of the division. So meanwhile, what was known as the psychoanalytic movement spread first all over Europe and then all over the world, and its two great representatives in the public mind were Sigmund Freud and Carl Gustav Jung. So now Jung could not be contained, and Freud was quite patient with him, because Freud's big idea was that these are his very words, we have discovered a new science which is going to be of tremendous importance, and we shouldn't have any this person has his own version and that person should be all united, and we are going to conquer the world. I mean, at least professionally. But Jung didn't go along with that. He said, if we find something like good scientists, then we have to publish it, and we have to try to find more. And so things got more and more difficult, and then Jung wrote a book, which year was this? I think that was probably probably right after World War I or toward the end of the war, and this was called, in German, is anybody here who speaks German, or should I just, brag about my German? Wandlungen und Symbole der Libido. Now, Freud invented a term called, he borrowed a Latin term called libido, which in Latin means pleasure. So he used that term to indicate that the psyche, as it was called already, the mind, likes to enjoy itself. And so that has to do with all the memories that we feel guilty for, but also with others, that it sort of creates various images and dreams and so forth, because they are pleasurable to the mind. And I think we can all agree with that, because I can distinctly tell, even if often I can have access to the dream content, but that when I woke up from a really very pleasant dream, then I feel pretty good. Much of the time in my old age dotage, however, I have dreams of a contrary nature, and then I wake up in a foul mood, and people better not come near me for another hour or so, because the dream makes me mad, So these things exist. But libido is sort of the psyche. Actually, later on, the Jungians called it psychic energy. In fact, Esther Harding, the great Jungian analyst who lived in New York for such a long time, Dr. Esther Harding wrote a whole great big book about it, Psychic Energy, quite a good book. In any event, so that's what really Jung meant, that the Wandlungen, the transformations and changes of this psychic energy, of the libido, and what it really contained to a large extent, that all kinds of mythological figures, ghostly apparitions, so really bordering the occult, that occur to people in their dreams and sometimes awake, that these are products of the unconscious, but of a deeper region of the unconscious than the one that Freud dealt with. Of course, to tell that to Freud invited decapitation. So now came the division. And so some people, you know, especially occult students, say that Jung and Freud split over the occult phenomena. That's not true. They both were very interested in occult phenomena, and I'll tell you a final statement of Freud about it that really indicates how interested he was. So that was not really the problem. What they were interested in, that even though Freud himself was very interested in mythology, in his office on, I think it was Neinberggasse in Vienna, that was his office. He also lived in the same building. His apartment was upstairs and his office was downstairs. And there was the famous couch, and his big, massive, beautiful desk. And really a huge surface. And on the desk were innumerable statues of ancient gods. He was quite interested in Egypt. Many of them Egyptian, others from other cultures, there they were. Now here he is objecting for Jung being so interested in ancient religions and mythology. He felt that he was too interested in that. When he was practicing it already, you know? And moreover, as some people have said, criticizing Freud later on, that maybe a lot of this was a reaction of Freud to the Mosaic commandments, thou shalt have no other God beside me. So he had not only another God, he had gods galore, you know. And you know, Freud never became religious in any sense, although he was interested in all those things. So any event, when Jung came out with the idea that it's really complex mythological figures of gods and goddesses and ghosts and all kinds of things, that they had a psychological basis, that there was yet a deeper layer of the unconscious, which contained these, what Jung came to call numinous, because a numen is another Greek word for God, numinous figures. And so Jung said, I beg to differ. There are things in the unconscious that you haven't discovered yet, and they are very mythological, and they work very much into religion and things of that sort. And I have seen them. I know what they are, and they are simply a deeper layer of the unconscious, which he came to call the collective unconscious. So now that really shut down Freud. Freud was hardly able to talk to Jung after that. Very unfortunate, because the two most brilliant men in the study of the mind but you know, that's how humans are, because we all have the individual desire to be ourselves and do our own thing. You know, whether it's really such a nice thing or not, it doesn't matter. But it's our mind, it's mine, it's all mine, it's my thing, it's my theory, it's my book, it's all of that. You know, that's how we are. And if we happen to be meek and mild, like a Jesus figure or so, well, let's say that's unusual among great people who often achieve greatness because they push for it. What you gonna do? In any event, so then there came really the division, and the Swiss school, the Zurich school grew, and of course Freud was I don't know, quite a bit older than Jung, and then came also, of course, all the terrible business with First World War I and then World War II, and Sigmund Freud was Jewish, and he had a large family, and two sons and I think 3 daughters. In any event, the trouble of the majority of the Freudian doctors who could have helped him out of there were themselves Jewish. They were all Viennese Jewish doctors. And so this really, then came the Nazis, came what in German we call the Anschluss, when Austria was enveloped and eaten up by Germany, and so all the psychologists had great anxiety about Freud. But what fortunately happened was that he had a disciple who was a very highly born and exalted personage. That was Princess Marie Bonaparte, a direct descendant of one of Napoleon's brothers. And Princess Bonaparte was also married to Prince Paul of Greece and had access to all kinds of money, which is fortunate for anybody, especially for a princess these days. And so she went to Germany, and she had prolonged negotiations with Goebbels, with Goering, and whoever the Gauleiter of Austria was, probably I think was, and said, look, if you let the Freud family go, you will have this much money deposited in a Swiss bank account to your account. You think you might want to do that? And they did it. She paid the Nazis off, and the Freud family was allowed to exit the German Reich to England. And from then on they were in London, and Dr. Freud, who already I think was ailing, he had a cancer of the palate in his mouth. People who are opposed to tobacco like to blame it on his frequent consumption of cigars. He had a particular little short Austrian cigar that he liked, but he kept on smoking. That had nothing to do with the unconscious. So anyway, he was there and he passed away. He passed away in London, largely attended to by one of his daughters, who just worshipped her father, and she actually became a rather unpleasant person subsequently. But I had the unpleasant duty to correspond with her because of my German and things like that. And she really didn't appreciate it that these Americans were writing about her father. But I said, look, he was a public figure, very, very famous man in the psychological field, and people are interested. But she very restrictive, very prissy kind of a person. I think she never married. In any event, that was, and of course Jung was trying to take over the International Psychoanalytic Association, which was mostly composed of Freudian analysts. He tried to protect the various people, and since he was German speaking, the Nazis would talk to him, but it became a very strained and difficult thing. Then he didn't deal with the Nazis any longer. But of course there were a lot of psychoanalysts in Germany and in Austria. So now where does all this lead us? Let's put it this way, in addition to his increasing fame as the leader of analytical psychology, as his school came to be called, he had what he felt were related interests. And as particularly some of his writings that were discovered after his death or so tell, he he had a complete idea of the what might be called the psychological orientation of Western culture from its beginnings. And he felt that the deepest contact with the psyche and with the collective unconscious, with the deepest psyche, was within the right after the time of Jesus, when early Christianity, and that it was among the people of Christians, early Christians of a particular orientation, religious orientation, that went down into history as Gnosticism, the knowers. And so Jung availed himself, once he came to that recognition. How he came to a lot of his recognitions, he never told. So, he was always on the edge of a deeper, a more meaningful, and ultimately more important world than this one. And he got insights, he got information from them, and they were sustained by synchronistic experiences. And let us say, he was a most unusual man, even in his time. But let's say it's quite evident that pretty early in his career, he, on a spiritual level, he became very interested in Gnosticism and in ancient philosophy, and he felt that therein could be found really the entryway into the collective unconscious, and that moreover what he respected in the Gnostics was that their great and ever-present teacher was their own psyche, that they learned from their own deepest soul. And he said, that's what we all have to do. We are looking for teachers, we are looking for professors, we are looking for this, that, the other thing. But if we opened our inner eyes, now these are my words, but certainly incompatible with Jung, then we could discover so much more. Because the deepest, in the deeper realms of the psyche, they are accessible only to those who know how to deal with them. And he discovered that in the ancient Gnostics, as when he died and when his library was being looked at and so forth, he had all the translations of Gnostic scriptures, primarily by G.R.S. Mead, who, of course, as many of you know or ought to know, and perhaps will know if you remember, who was Madame Blavatsky's private secretary, and he was with her right up to her death, and who was the greatest classical Gnostic and Hermetic scholar of his days, and Jung owned all of his books. And not only that, but in the 1930s, when Mead was in London, of course Blavatsky died before the turn of the century, Jung went to London with the express purpose to visit G.R.S. Mead. And he thanked him for his translations of the Gnostic scriptures, and he told him, saying, they were the last people in our culture who were still speaking out of their soul. And he says, we have to have more access to our soul, and then we can do the same. The books, all of G.R.S. Mead's translations are still there in Küsnacht, Zurich, in Jung's old house. They also have one tiny little book of mine there, namely the Gnostic Jung and the Seven Sermons to the Dead, which I had given to Jung's son, sent it with somebody, and they incorporated it in Jung's library, for which I am very, very grateful. In any event, there was, let us say, the undertone, the secret life, and was not entirely unknown to Freud. Freud was, it also has been found, see, this is how we are found out. When we get old and then we die, almost all of us do, and then people come and look at our books and says, oh, Dr. Freud had a book on the Kabbalah. Oh, it was the English translation of the Zohar by one of the early scholarly members of the Golden Dawn. Freud, Sigmund Freud, carried that book with him wherever he traveled. It was on his bedside. That and Goethe's Faust. You put it together. He was these were all very, very literate people. They really knew their poets, they really knew their languages, and of course they were both still in the period where they had a classical education, so they knew Latin and Greek, which also helps you in later on in life, as I have found traveling around various places. But let's say, in any event, let's say, now we could say with some degree of truthfulness that Jung had, as we all ought to really, had two lives. And one of them was his scientific life. He was a medical doctor. He was what we now call a psychiatrist, alienist in those days. And he felt that by helping people to become less neurotic, by resolving their complexes, and that was his word, and so they would become more insightful, more wise, more accomplished people, and that this was a very worthwhile undertaking. But at the same time, he also had, you might say, a secret life, the main documentation of which is the Red Book, which was which he had hidden away all these years, and that after his death, with their commendable and ever-present interest in money, the Jung family managed to market the Red Book. And they found a very good editor, Dr. Shamdasani, a very great man, and others. And now, by way of the Red Book, we have, let's say, another window into Carl Jung's life. And that reveals, we could, maybe we'll do another series on the Red Book again. I was the first person, as far as we know, in the world, who, after the publication of the Red Book and its availability, did a series of 13 lectures that were recorded on the Red Book. And those 13 lectures were read not by the editor of the Red Book and by all the 4 translators. Now, if it were a bunch of balderdash, then they wouldn't have read it. And so that's a fairly, in any event, so shall we say, I am rather well acquainted with it. And that is really a documentation of his astonishing and very, very numerous visions and disclosures, even to the point of prophecy of one that I mentioned before, rather a brief one of the coming of the new aeon, which would be governed by a new deity, and which probably would be about coming into existence now, because this is the same that we had all the hullabaloo about in the 60s, Aquarius. We even had an Aquarius theater down here. It wasn't a very good theater, and all of that. And well, of course, it's the zodiacal ages, which Jung recognized were correlated with his vision. So he saw a new era, a new great period of history, the the Aquarian age coming, and he revealed to some extent of what his visions were about that coming, what it would contain in spiritual keynotes and so forth, and that is really what is contained in the Black Book. Now there are additional writings. There is a whole bunch of books, of small books that are called the Black Books. And they were also edited by the same people who edited the Red Book. But they are mostly notes, letters, reflections. They don't quite have the prophetic quality and the power of the Red Book. I mean, the Red Book is really, I mean, this belongs over there with the Bible and with the Mahabharata and other holy books. It really is. It also has wonderful colored illustrations, which are not really illustrations, but are just Jung's artwork, spiritual artwork that are in there. And I have several ways that I can look at them. Why not brag a little bit, as to myself. So I can brag about it that I have the first edition, which in English, that was published. Then I have the German edition. Then I have the second edition in English. And then I have a German edition. And it's all, and the comparisons are quite interesting. Also, in some of the editions, the reference notes and footnoting are very valuable because they were really put in by a very enthusiastic and very well-informed man, Dr. Sonu Shamdasamy, who was the editor of the book, and without whom the Red Book would have never seen the light of day. And so, let's see, we now know, at least, let's see, we have the documentation of some of Jung's secret life. And it was an utterly visionary, transcendental, spiritual life, which he utilized some of the insights from there for his scientific work. But the two were the same. So I think we have here, and able only to say so much about him tonight, we have here a pioneer of the entry into the psyche in Western culture, and a pioneer for the recovery of the esoteric tradition within that context. And I think that's an incredible and magnificent accomplishment, and that we should keep our eye on Jung and on his works. If you are thus inclined, I have been guilty of writing 4 books about Jung myself, the best of which in my estimation, but the author is never right about those things, is the Gnostic Jung and the 7 Sermons to the Dead, which was a sort of pioneering work. That was the first book disclosing really Jung's esoteric connection on the basis of something that he wrote. And let me tell you, not all the Jungians were happy about it. I heard many comments, it's going to make a religious leader, going to make a cult leader out of Jung. I said, I have not made him into anything that he wasn't, and I hope that nobody else will either. So that was the beginning of the discovery, so to say, of his esoteric side. But undoubtedly, a man who wrote 16 big volumes that were for the public. And then he wrote this great big folio volume with the beautiful pictures and so for the inner public. And so I think we know a great deal about it, that this was truly an unusually prophetic person who was here in our midst and who left us a heritage which is still in many ways not disclosed, but which is worthy of contemplation and study. And I, ever since the time when I had the first contact with the material that I later on put into the Jung and the Lost Gospels, one of the three different things that I am the most grateful for in my life was that I lived at the same time with Carl Jung. I never met him in person. I went to Switzerland. He was already quite old. I was a student across the border to Austria, and I got to a reasonable distance to the Jung Institute, and there were people coming out, and there was this, he was already pretty old, leaning on a cane. There was this robust, strong, broad-shouldered person with a pipe in his mind. Das ist der Dr. Jung, das ist der Dr. Jung. That's him, you know. So I saw him from the distance, but nothing else. And, you know, one of his greatest interpreters, in my view, not everybody shares that view, Dr. Edward Edinger, who died here in Los Angeles. He was from the East, New York analyst to begin with. Dr. Edinger became one of the best interpreters of Jung. Edinger had never seen him in the flesh either. So you're not necessarily deprived if you haven't seen Jung. I've seen him in a number of dreams, which I'm sure he would appreciate, and I hope for more. But I must say that I am grateful from the bottom of my heart to the higher power that I lived at a time when this great, mysterious, learned, prophetic individual lived in the world, and where we could profit by his work in various ways. I really am, and I always will be.